There's a moment in every major war when the curtain slips, even briefly, and you catch a glimpse of the machinery that was always hidden behind the grand statements, the official press releases, and the diplomatic handshakes. That moment arrived on the 17th of March, 2026, when Saudi Arabia stepped in front of the world's cameras and officially denied a report published by the New York Times. The report alleged something extraordinary. It alleged that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the man who rules the most powerful Arab kingdom on earth, had been privately calling Donald Trump and urging him to keep hitting the Iranians hard. Saudi Arabia said it never happened. Saudi Arabia said the report was false. Saudi Arabia, in the language of official diplomacy, rejected it categorically. And in doing so, Saudi Arabia may have done something it never intended. It may have opened the single most important question of this entire war, a question that cuts through the propaganda, the bomb damage assessments, and the diplomatic posturing to reach the cold, hard architecture of power underneath. The question is simply this: if the calls did not happen, why did the Washington Post, citing 4 separate officials with direct knowledge, already confirm weeks earlier that Saudi lobbying directly influenced Trump's decision to attack Iran in the first place? And if the calls did happen, what does it mean that the kingdom is now publicly running away from a war it privately engineered? To understand why this denial matters, you have to go back to the weeks before February 28, 2026, the day that American and Israeli bombs began falling on Iranian cities and Iranian leadership. In the official version of events, the United States acted because Iran posed a nuclear threat, because the moment was strategically optimal, and because the President of the United States made a sovereign decision to protect American interests. That is the version you will hear in congressional testimony. That is the version you will find in White House press briefings. But there is another version, documented not by fringe bloggers or anonymous message boards, but by the Washington Post, by 4 named categories of officials with direct knowledge, published before any political pressure could fully shape the narrative. In that version, Donald Trump launched the most consequential military operation of his second term, after weeks of sustained lobbying by 2 regional powers, who wanted this war far more than American intelligence analysts believed the situation required. One of those powers was Israel. The other was Saudi Arabia. And the figure at the center of Saudi Arabia's campaign was Mohammed bin Salman himself, making multiple private phone calls to Donald Trump, advocating military action, even as Saudi Arabia's public posture was entirely different, even as MBS was telling the Arab world and the international community that diplomacy was the preferred path. This is the double game, and it is not new. It is, in fact, the defining feature of how Mohammed bin Salman has operated since he consolidated power in 2017. He says one thing in public. He presents himself as a force for regional stability, even as he wages devastating proxy wars in Yemen. He signs normalization agreements with Iran in 2023 that produce photographs of smiling diplomats while, according to the Washington Post and the New York Times, working behind the scenes to push the United States toward a military confrontation with Tehran that could eliminate the Iranian threat permanently. The man is a master of narrative duality, and for years, it worked. The world watched the glittering NEOM announcements, the concerts, the cinemas, the social reforms, and allowed itself to believe the performance. But wars have a way of exposing everything. And this war, which has now consumed 3 full weeks of the 2026 calendar year, is beginning to expose the architecture of MBS's ambition in ways that no amount of official denial can fully conceal. Let us be precise about what the New York Times actually reported. According to its sources, Mohammed bin Salman was not merely a passive observer to the American and Israeli military campaign against Iran. He was actively engaged with Donald Trump throughout the lead-up period. He was conveying, in private conversations, the strategic wisdom of what Saudi Arabia's late King Abdullah had once described as the need to cut off the head of the snake. He was urging the American president to continue striking hard, to not pull back, to not allow Iran to reconstitute its power after absorbing the initial blows. The Times characterized MBS as someone who was speaking regularly with Trump and encouraging the escalation of military action, even as the kingdom publicly maintained its preference for diplomatic resolution. When that report landed, Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry moved quickly. The denial was categorical. No such calls advocating escalation had taken place, the kingdom said. The relationship between the Crown Prince and the American president was characterized in the most anodyne terms possible. Nothing to see here, nothing unusual. Certainly nothing as dramatic as a Gulf monarch privately steering the United States toward the most significant Middle Eastern military campaign in 2 decades. The problem, of course, is that the Washington Post had already established the basic structure of Saudi involvement 3 weeks earlier. That reporting did not come from anonymous sources with theoretical access. It came from 4 people familiar with the matter, a formulation that in American national security journalism typically represents direct participants or those briefed immediately after key meetings. What it established was not merely that Israel lobbied for the strikes, which surprised no one. What it established was that Saudi Arabia played an active role, that MBS made multiple private calls to Trump advocating military action, and that the White House decision followed these weeks of sustained pressure from both regional powers. American intelligence assessments, the Post reported, saw no imminent threat from Iran at the time. The intelligence community did not believe the moment required military action, but Israel and Saudi Arabia argued the opposite. And Trump, who has historically been responsive to the arguments of allies who flatter him and frame their requests in terms of American strength and dominance, moved in the direction his regional partners were pushing. Now the bombs have been falling for 3 weeks. Iran has retaliated with a ferocity that shocked even analysts who predicted a significant response. For the first time in modern history, Iran has attacked every single member state of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have all absorbed Iranian missiles and drones. Not since the tanker war of the 1980s had Iran openly targeted Gulf territory at this scale, and even then the attacks were more limited and more focused. What Iran did beginning February 28, 2026, was categorically different. In the first 24 hours alone, Iran fired 167 ballistic and cruise missiles and 541 drones at the United Arab Emirates. Dubai's airport was struck. The Jebel Ali port, which processes roughly a third of all UAE imports, caught fire. A Shahed drone struck near the Fairmont Hotel on Palm Jumeirah. Debris from intercepted missiles shattered windows in the Marina District. The ADNOC refinery in Ruwais, which produces 922,000 barrels of oil per day, was forced offline. In Bahrain, the United States Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters was targeted. In Kuwait, the airport was hit, and 3 American F-15 fighter jets were destroyed by Iranian strikes, with one incident initially described as possible friendly fire causing additional casualties. In Qatar, Al Udeid Air Base, which houses the largest American military installation in the Middle East, absorbed a wave of drone attacks. In Saudi Arabia, missiles were intercepted over Riyadh and the eastern province. 2 ballistic missiles were fired at Prince Sultan Air Base in Al-Kharj. Drones were intercepted heading for the Sheba oil field, one of the kingdom's most critical energy assets. 2 Iranian drones struck the United States Embassy compound in Riyadh, causing a fire and what Saudi officials described as minor damage. Saudi Arabia stood at the center of something it had spent decades and extraordinary amounts of diplomatic and financial capital trying to prevent. Its cities were under attack. Its critical infrastructure was threatened. Its airspace was contested. And, according to mounting evidence from multiple credible Western news organizations, its own crown prince had helped create the conditions for exactly this outcome. The human cost was becoming impossible to ignore. By March 17th, the Human Rights Watch report documented at least 11 civilian deaths and 268 injuries across Gulf Cooperation Council states, with the majority of victims being migrant workers, the invisible labor force that keeps the Gulf's economy functioning, and who had no voice in any of the decisions that produced this conflict. A Bangladeshi national named Saleh Ahmed was killed on the very first night, February 28th, struck by debris while delivering water in the UAE. His son confirmed the details to Human Rights Watch researchers. At least 10 of the dead were foreign nationals. In Bahrain, 32 citizens, including children, were injured in a single drone attack on the Sitra district south of Manama. The Bapco State Oil Company declared force majeure on its shipments after its refinery complex caught fire from Iranian strikes. In Kuwait, the deaths included an American soldier, 20-year-old Declan Cody of West Des Moines, Iowa, killed at a command center. His body was returned to Dover Air Force Base on March 7th, where Trump, Melania, Vice President Vance, and the Second Lady paid their respects. "It is a very sad day," Trump told reporters, and then he boarded Air Force One and returned to Florida. The economic consequences of the conflict were accelerating beyond anyone's initial projections. Oil prices crossed $100 per barrel for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Brent crude reached $107.70, West Texas. Intermediate surged to $108 per barrel, a gain of nearly 19% in a single trading session, the largest weekly gain in futures trading history dating back to 1983. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of all global oil trade passes, remained effectively closed. According to Lloyd's List estimates, even with American naval escorts, no more than roughly 10% of lost volumes could realistically be restored. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had pipeline routes that bypassed Hormuz, but those alternatives were already partly utilized. Combined exports from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Oman via non-Gulf ports had climbed to roughly 6 million barrels per day but fell far short of offsetting the disruption. Qatar, the world's second largest exporter of natural gas, shut its production entirely during the conflict's most intense phases. Bahrain declared force majeure. Iraq's southern oil fields saw production fall by 70%. The Fertilizer Institute noted that 50% of global urea and sulfur exports transit Hormuz, meaning that agricultural supply chains and food prices in dozens of countries were beginning to feel the secondary effects of a war they had nothing to do with starting. Donald Trump dismissed the oil price spike as a small price to pay for removing the alleged threat of Iran's nuclear program. This was a remarkable statement for a president who had spent his entire political career arguing that energy prices were the clearest indicator of presidential competence. Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, offered a more measured assessment. While Iran continued to enrich uranium to high levels, Grossi stated there was currently no evidence or indication of a systematic, ongoing program to produce a nuclear weapon. This was, in essence, an expert confirmation that the stated justification for the war did not align with the intelligence picture that existed at the moment the first bombs fell. The war had begun without an imminent threat. It had been urged by regional powers who stood to benefit from Iranian weakening. And now 3 weeks in, the man who had privately lobbied for it was standing before the world press and denying that any of it had happened. This is why Mohammed bin Salman's denial is not merely a diplomatic formality. It is a window into the fundamental logic of Gulf statecraft. MBS understood from the beginning that his double game carried enormous risks. If the war went well, if Iran was decisively weakened, its nuclear program destroyed, its capacity to project power across the region neutralized, then Saudi Arabia would be the primary beneficiary. Iran's influence over Iraqi politics, its support for the Houthi movement in Yemen, its funding of Hezbollah in Lebanon, its reach into Syria, all of this would be degraded or eliminated. Saudi Arabia's regional hegemony, long constrained by the countervailing Iranian power, would expand dramatically. Saudi Arabia's ability to define the terms of Gulf security, to set energy policy, to shape the political future of Arab states from Morocco to Pakistan would be dramatically enhanced. The prize was enormous, and MBS believed, apparently, that the United States and Israel could deliver it. Iran did not collapse in the first week. Iranian retaliation was more extensive and more damaging than the Gulf states had anticipated. And now Saudi Arabia, which had positioned itself as a neutral party, publicly supporting diplomacy, while privately pushing for military action, found itself in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. Its cities had been struck. Its oil infrastructure had been threatened. Its relationship with Iran, carefully rebuilt through Chinese brokered negotiations in 2023, was in ruins. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was on CBS categorically rejecting any ceasefire negotiation. "We have never asked for a ceasefire," he told the anchor. "We have never asked even for negotiation. We are ready to defend ourselves as long as it takes." These were not the words of a regime on the verge of collapse. These were the words of a government that had decided to absorb the blows and bleed its opponents economically and strategically over time. Iran's missile and drone strategy evolved in precisely this direction as the conflict continued. In the first 48 hours, the barrages were massive. Hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones. The numbers were designed to overwhelm air defense systems and establish psychological dominance. But by day 15 of the conflict, the daily attack figures had dropped dramatically. Where Iran had once fired 167 missiles in a single day, it was now firing 4 missiles and 6 drones against the UAE per day. The volume had collapsed. But the experts who analyzed this shift were careful to distinguish between declining capability and strategic pivot. According to analysts quoted by major news organizations, the reduction was not simply a sign of degradation. It was also consistent with a war of attrition strategy. Iran's central calculation, according to experts at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, was that Gulf and Israeli air defenses would run out of interceptor missiles before Iran ran out of projectiles to fire. The Shahed 136 drone, which can be manufactured quickly and in large numbers in relatively simple factories, does not require complex launch infrastructure. It cannot be easily targeted in airstrikes. Each one forces the defending side to expend an interceptor missile that costs orders of magnitude more to produce. At 185 kilometers per hour, a Shahed can theoretically be shot down by a helicopter. But when they come in waves, or when they come at irregular intervals during a sustained campaign, the arithmetic begins to favor the attacker. The White House's declaration that Iran's ballistic missile capacity was functionally destroyed was almost immediately contradicted by Qatar's announcement that it had intercepted a new Iranian missile on the very same day the declaration was made. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain issued fresh alerts within hours of that statement. Inside Iran, the internal picture was revealing fractures that the war had exposed with brutal clarity. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had been killed in the initial American and Israeli strikes on February 28th. The Islamic Republic's top leadership structure, built over 4 decades around the figure of the Supreme Leader, had been decapitated. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the killed leader, was named as the new Supreme Leader, but reports indicated he was wounded and possibly disfigured from the strikes. American Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said the new Supreme Leader was likely wounded and had not made any personal appearances. Mojtaba Khamenei issued a statement, but he did not appear physically, fueling speculation about the severity of his injuries. In his first public statement, he warned that as long as American bases in the region remained operational, Iranian attacks would continue. The announcement of an interim leadership council by Iran's top security official revealed something even more significant about the depth of the institutional crisis inside the Islamic Republic. The very establishment of an interim council suggested that the structures of Iranian governance were under extreme stress, that the normal chain of command had been disrupted in ways that official statements could not fully conceal. Even more revealing was the gap between Iranian President Pezeshkian and the Revolutionary Guards. Pezeshkian apparently apologized to neighboring Gulf states for the strikes and ordered the armed forces to stop targeting them. The Revolutionary Guards continued the attacks anyway. This was not a minor administrative disagreement. This was an open rupture between the elected civilian government of Iran and the unelected military religious apparatus that ultimately controls Iranian strategic decisions. The country was at war, not just with the United States and Israel, but with itself, and that internal struggle was playing out through the trajectory of missiles landing in Dubai and Doha and Riyadh. The Revolutionary Guards reported directly to the Supreme Leader's office and treated the president's orders as subordinate to revolutionary ideological imperatives. When Pezeshkian attempted to stop the Gulf strikes, he was effectively overruled by a parallel command structure that had concluded the Gulf states had forfeited any claim to neutrality the moment their soil was used as a staging ground for American and Israeli military operations against the Islamic Republic. Meanwhile, the Trump administration was confronting its own internal dissent. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, resigned. His reason was unambiguous. Iran, he said, had posed no imminent threat to the United States. This was a direct challenge to the legal and strategic justification for the war, coming from inside the apparatus that the administration would normally rely on to defend its decisions. Intelligence assessments had not identified an imminent threat. The decision had been made anyway, and made according to the Washington Post's reporting, after sustained lobbying by Israel and Saudi Arabia. And now, as the economic consequences of the conflict spread globally, and as American military personnel were dying in Kuwait and other Gulf installations, the coherence of the original decision was being questioned not just by critics, but by people who had worked within the system and understood what the intelligence had actually said. For the Gulf states, the situation had produced what analysts described as an impossible choice. They had absorbed Iranian strikes. Their people were sheltering from missile barrages. Their economies were being disrupted by the closure of shipping lanes and the spike in oil prices. And yet they were being asked, implicitly or explicitly, to join the American and Israeli military coalition formally, to step up and help secure the Strait of Hormuz, to contribute their military forces to an operation whose origins they had, at least some of them, helped engineer. Trump slammed his allies openly for their low enthusiasm when he proposed a coalition to keep Hormuz open. Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Australia, Italy, and Greece all declined to participate in naval escort missions. The European Union's top diplomat said with painful candor that nobody was ready to put their people in harm's way in the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia and the UAE publicly condemned Iranian aggression and declared their support for all measures to confront what the Saudi Foreign Ministry called reprehensible Iranian aggressions. But they stopped short of formal military participation in offensive operations. They were walking a line that grew thinner with each passing day. They were condemning the country they had helped provoke into retaliating against them. Former CIA Director David Petraeus identified the strategic error at the center of Iran's own calculus. By targeting all Gulf Cooperation Council states, by sending missiles and drones into cities that had maintained official neutrality, Iran had done something counterproductive to its own long-term interests. It had given the Gulf monarchies a direct stake in Iranian defeat. Before the Iranian retaliations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar could maintain the fiction of non-involvement, a fiction that allowed them to manage their domestic politics, their relationships with Muslim-majority populations in their countries and globally, and their economic relationships with countries that had not endorsed the American campaign. Once Iranian missiles began landing in Riyadh and Dubai and Doha, that fiction became increasingly difficult to maintain. UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed and MBS jointly warned that continued Iranian attacks on Gulf states could lead to a regional escalation beyond anything currently being contemplated. This was not the language of neutral mediators. This was the language of parties who were being pulled, whether they liked it or not, toward the center of the conflict. Use the conflict to enhance your own strategic position without fully exposing yourself to its consequences. The difference was that Turkey had not lobbied privately for the war's beginning. Saudi Arabia, according to two major American newspapers citing multiple officials with direct knowledge, had done exactly that. The contrast between Turkey's posture and Saudi Arabia's posture illuminated something important about the strategic miscalculation at the heart of MBS's approach. Erdogan would emerge from this conflict with enhanced diplomatic credibility. MBS would emerge from it having absorbed Iranian missiles in exchange for a regional transformation that remained, at best, partial and incomplete. The oil markets were pricing in a scenario that only weeks earlier would have seemed like geopolitical fiction. At $100 per barrel and rising, every country in the world was absorbing the economic consequences of decisions made in private phone calls between a crown prince and an American president. Germany was facing an energy price shock in an economy already struggling under years of deindustrialization. Japan, which imports virtually all of its energy, was watching its trade balance deteriorate in real time. South Korea, heavily dependent on Gulf crude, was confronting fuel price increases that threatened its export competitiveness. India, which had carefully cultivated relationships with both Iran and the Gulf states, found itself in an extraordinarily difficult position, trying to maintain oil supply agreements with countries that were now at war with each other or with the United States, its most important strategic partner. China, which had brokered the Saudi-Iran normalization in 2023 and had enormous economic interests in both countries, was facing a situation of maximum complexity. On one hand, higher oil prices benefit Chinese leverage by weakening Western economies and increasing the cost of maintaining the American military presence in the Gulf. On the other hand, China's own energy imports, its manufacturing costs, and its export competitiveness all suffer from elevated commodity prices. Beijing had called for an immediate ceasefire while simultaneously watching the situation with the calculating attention of a power that understood it stood to gain regardless of the military outcome. Russia, whose entire post-Ukraine sanctions budget arithmetic depended on oil revenue, watched crude prices rise above $100 and quietly calculated the windfall. Every dollar increase in the price of Brent crude represented hundreds of millions of additional dollars flowing into Russian coffers annually. The war that MBS had privately championed was effectively providing Vladimir Putin with an economic lifeline at a moment when Western sanctions and the ongoing cost of the Ukraine conflict had placed serious pressure on Russian fiscal stability. This was not an outcome that any of the war's architects had apparently modeled. The interconnected nature of global energy markets meant that the geopolitical consequences of MBS's double game extended far beyond the immediate theater of conflict, strengthening an adversary that the United States had spent 3 years trying to weaken. The Amnesty International investigation that confirmed an American strike had killed more than 160 schoolgirls at a primary school in Manab was still reverberating through the international community. The strike had occurred during the initial phase of the campaign when American bombers were targeting what the Pentagon described as military infrastructure and command and control nodes in southern Iran. The Manab school was near what American officials claimed was a dual-use facility. Amnesty's investigators found no credible evidence that the school or its immediate surroundings were being used for any military purpose. They found evidence of 163 dead, of whom 161 were children between the ages of 6 and 14, and 2 were teachers. The images that circulated from Manab became the visual signature of the war's humanitarian dimension in the same way that certain photographs had defined earlier conflicts. They were shared hundreds of millions of times. They were shown in parliaments in Ankara and Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur. They provoked street protests in Karachi, Istanbul, Tunis, and Jakarta. They created political pressure on governments that had maintained silence or expressed only mild concern about the campaign's civilian toll. And they created, for the Gulf states whose populations are overwhelmingly Muslim, a profound domestic political challenge that no official statement condemning Iranian aggression could fully manage. Human rights organizations were documenting civilian casualties on both sides with meticulous thoroughness. In Iran, at least 1,330 civilians had died from American and Israeli strikes by mid-March. More than 100,000 Iranians had been displaced from their homes. In Lebanon, 394 people had been killed since the conflict began, as Israeli operations against Hezbollah escalated alongside the main campaign. In Israel, 15 people had died from Iranian-backed rocket fire. The total death toll across the entire region had exceeded 1,850 people in less than 3 weeks of conflict. These were not the casualties of a surgical, targeted campaign. These were the casualties of a war. And wars, as every student of history understands, have a momentum of their own. They do not end cleanly when the strategic objectives of the initiating parties have been partially achieved. They continue because the parties being attacked develop their own objectives, their own grievances, their own determination to reshape the outcome in their favor. The Baghdad dimension added yet another layer of complexity to an already layered crisis. On March 17th, an explosion struck the United States Embassy compound in Baghdad. Kataib Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Iraqi militia, claimed responsibility. The Green Zone, which had been fortified over 2 decades of American military and diplomatic presence in Iraq, was no longer the secure perimeter it had once been. A drone struck a luxury hotel in the Green Zone's periphery, setting its upper floors on fire. The senior Kataib Hezbollah commander Abu Ali al-Askari was killed in a subsequent American strike in response, but the message had been delivered. The conflict was not contained to the Gulf. It was spreading through the network of Iran-aligned armed groups that stretched from Lebanon to Iraq to Syria to Yemen, the so-called axis of resistance that Iran had spent decades building and funding, and training precisely for a moment like this one. Yemen's Houthis, who had already demonstrated their capacity to disrupt global shipping during the Gaza War of 2023 and 2024, were now firing at commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden at a rate that exceeded their peak activity from those earlier campaigns. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting to transit the region had reached levels that made many routes commercially unviable. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, another critical global shipping choke point, was effectively closed to commercial traffic. Combined with the Hormuz disruption, the world was confronting a scenario in which 2 of the most critical maritime passages for global trade were simultaneously compromised. The knock-on effects for global supply chains were only beginning to emerge in the economic data. Container shipping costs had doubled. Delivery times for manufactured goods from Asia to Europe had extended by weeks. The phrase multi-front shipping crisis was appearing in central bank communications and Treasury Department briefings in capitals from Washington to Brussels to Tokyo. And yet, none of this had been sufficient to produce the ceasefire that the United Nations Secretary General had been calling for since the first day of the conflict. The Security Council remained paralyzed. Any resolution demanding a ceasefire would be vetoed by the United States. China and Russia had introduced a joint resolution. It was vetoed within hours. The diplomatic architecture that had been built to manage exactly this kind of crisis was failing in real time, and the failure was directly traceable to the decision to launch a war that the intelligence community had not endorsed, that no international legal body had authorized, and that at least one of the governments most responsible for its origins was now publicly denying any role in creating. And at the center of it all, the Saudi denial sits like a door that opens onto everything the official narrative wants to keep closed. If Saudi Arabia made no such calls, no such lobbying, no such private advocacy for escalation, then the Washington Post's 4 officials are lying. The New York Times' multiple unnamed sources are fabricating. The pattern of behavior that analysts and diplomats and scholars of Gulf statecraft have documented for years, the pattern of public moderation combined with private aggression that has characterized MBS's regional strategy since he rose to power, is somehow, in this one instance, entirely different from every other instance. If Saudi Arabia never lobbied for this war, then the war happened because American intelligence, which saw no imminent threat, was simply overruled by a president who decided unilaterally to take the biggest gamble of his second term with no external encouragement. That is the version Saudi Arabia now needs the world to believe. The alternative, which the evidence strongly suggests, is that Mohammed bin Salman has been running the most consequential double game of his career. He identified the Iranian nuclear and regional challenge as an existential threat to Saudi dominance. He identified Donald Trump, a president uniquely susceptible to flattery, transactional arguments, and the framing of military action as strength, as the instrument through which that threat could be eliminated. He identified the private phone call as the mechanism, a mechanism that would leave no formal record, that would require sources inside the White House to expose, that could be plausibly denied if the political costs of acknowledgement became too high. He watched the bombs begin to fall on February 28th. He watched Iran retaliate. He watched his own cities absorb Iranian missiles, and he calculated that even this was an acceptable price for a war that could permanently reset the regional balance of power in Saudi Arabia's favor. And when the New York Times published its report and the political pressure to disavow the entire enterprise became too great, he reached for the deny button. He denied it. And in denying it, he may have told the world more about the architecture of this war than any admission ever could. That is the double game. That is MBS. And that is why this denial, which will be forgotten by most of the world's media within 48 hours, absorbed into the endless scroll of missile intercepts and oil price updates and diplomatic statements that constitute the daily texture of a regional war, may actually be the single most consequential development of the last 12 hours, because it is the moment when the man who helped light this fire tried to walk backward out of the burning room. And the problem with fires is that they do not care who started them. They burn regardless. The Strait of Hormuz is still partially closed. Oil is still above $100. Iranian missiles are still reaching the Gulf, even as their numbers decline. American soldiers are still dying in Kuwait and Baghdad and Al-Udeid. Schoolgirls in Minab are still dead. Migrant workers in Dubai and Manama are still being buried without ceremony. And a crown prince in Riyadh is on the telephone, telling the world that none of it was his idea. History will have the patience to sort through these denials. History always does. The phone calls that were never made will eventually be declassified or leaked or confirmed by memoirs written by the participants decades hence. The private conversations that shaped the biggest military campaign in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq will eventually find their way into the public record, the way all secrets eventually do. What we know right now, in this moment, with the war entering its fourth week and the world holding its breath over a waterway that carries 20% of global energy supply, is that the denial itself is a form of confession. You do not issue a categorical official statement denying something that was never alleged. You do not mobilize the Saudi foreign ministry apparatus at speed unless the original allegation carries enough credibility to threaten something important. Saudi Arabia denied because the truth, or something close enough to it, had already been confirmed by American journalists citing American officials who were there when it happened. And the denial came not because the reports were wrong, but because the consequences of what those reports described are now landing on Saudi soil in the form of Iranian ballistic missiles. The double game is not sustainable when the second player in your game decides to burn down the board. This is where the story of MBS's double game ultimately leads, not to a moment of triumph, in which Iran is defeated and Saudi Arabia emerges as the unchallenged hegemon of the Arabian Peninsula, but to a moment of profound vulnerability, in which a leader who bet everything on a private strategy has been exposed by the very conflict he privately championed, and now stands before the world, issuing denials that the world is not fully equipped to disprove, but is no longer entirely inclined to believe. The war will continue. The missiles will keep flying. The oil prices will keep fluctuating. And the question of who really started this fire and why will hang over everything that comes next, in every negotiation, every ceasefire proposal, every post-war regional order discussion. It will hang over MBS personally, over his Vision 2030 project, over his carefully constructed image as a reformer and a modernizer and a pragmatist who wants only stability and prosperity for his people. Because stability and prosperity are not what you get when you privately tell the most powerful president in the world to keep hitting the Iranians hard, and then Iranian missiles come crashing down on the very kingdom you swore to protect. That is what you get when the double game finally plays itself out to its inevitable end. The deeper you dig into the mechanics of how this war was assembled, the more clearly you see the layers of coordination that preceded the first bomb. Mohammed bin Salman did not simply pick up the phone one day and call Donald Trump with a spontaneous suggestion to attack Iran. The groundwork for this moment had been laid across years of careful strategic positioning. Saudi Arabia spent enormous resources cultivating relationships inside the American foreign policy establishment, inside the network of think tanks and policy institutes, and former officials and consultants who shape the intellectual climate in which presidential decisions are made. The argument that Iran represented an existential threat to Gulf stability and American interests was not invented in 2026. It had been developed, refined, and amplified across years of conferences and papers and private briefings and op-eds. By the time Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, the ideological groundwork for confrontation with Iran had been thoroughly prepared. All it required was someone to decide the moment had arrived. And according to the evidence that has since become available, that someone was not acting alone. Consider what MBS had to gain from permanent Iranian strategic degradation. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been locked in a regional Cold War for nearly half a century. The two countries represent competing visions of Islamic governance, competing ethnic and sectarian identities, and competing claims to regional leadership. Iran's revolution in 1979 upended a regional order that had been comfortable for the House of Saud. Tehran's subsequent decision to export its revolutionary ideology to back proxy forces throughout the Arab world and to develop ballistic missiles and nuclear enrichment capacity in defiance of international pressure represented a sustained challenge to Saudi primacy that no amount of oil money could fully neutralize. The Houthis, who had spent a decade ravaging Yemen and threatening Saudi border towns and oil infrastructure with Iranian-supplied missiles, were a daily reminder that Iranian power could reach into the heart of the peninsula. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, Assad's survival in Syria, the slow erosion of Gulf security through Iranian proxy warfare, all of it was a source of constant strategic anxiety in Riyadh. If the United States and Israel could be persuaded to strike Iran with sufficient force to permanently degrade its military capacity, its nuclear program, its missile forces, and its ability to fund and supply its regional proxies, then the strategic calculus of the Middle East would shift fundamentally in Saudi Arabia's favor. Not for a decade, not for a generation. Permanently, that was the prize. And for MBS, a man who thinks in terms of a 100-year strategic horizon, who has described his ambitions for Saudi Arabia in terms that stretch across generations, that prize was worth almost any short-term cost. The 2023 Normalization Agreement with Iran, brokered by China and Beijing, needs to be understood against this backdrop. When MBS shook hands with Iranian officials and signed agreements to restore diplomatic relations, the Western media largely interpreted it as a sign of pragmatism, a recognition that the conflicts of the past were too costly and that a new era of Gulf stability was possible. Some analysts warned against this interpretation. They noted that Saudi Arabia had signed similar agreements with Iran before, in 1998 and again in 2016, and that neither agreement had altered the fundamental dynamic of the relationship. What MBS was actually doing in 2023, these analysts argued, was buying time, managing the immediate pressures of the Yemen conflict, and simultaneously performing the moderation that his domestic reform agenda required. He needed foreign investment for Vision 2030. He needed international legitimacy after the Khashoggi affair. He needed the optics of a peacemaking statesman, not a regional hawk. The Normalization Agreement delivered all of that. It did not reflect a genuine strategic realignment. It reflected MBS's ability to present multiple faces simultaneously to different audiences. The face of moderation for the international business community, the face of strength and resolve for his domestic constituency and his regional rivals, and the face of strategic partnership for the American president he was cultivating as his primary instrument of geopolitical transformation. The Khashoggi precedent is worth examining in this context because it established something important about how MBS makes decisions. In October 2018, journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in an operation that American intelligence subsequently assessed was approved by Mohammed bin Salman himself. The international response was fierce. Sanctions were imposed. Saudi Arabia was condemned at the United Nations. Weapons sales were suspended by several countries. Business leaders boycotted Saudi investment conferences. And yet, within 2 years, MBS had largely weathered the storm. Crown princes who had been photographed shaking his hand refused to shake his hand for a period, and then returned to shaking his hand. Business deals resumed. Diplomatic relationships normalized. The lesson that MBS drew from Khashoggi was not that extreme measures carry unbearable costs. The lesson was that extreme measures carry temporary costs that can be managed through a combination of economic leverage, strategic patience, and the reliable tendency of the international community to prioritize interests over principles. If you are the custodian of the world's largest proven oil reserves, people will eventually come back to the table. They always do. That same logic appears to have governed MBS's calculation about the Iran war. Yes, Iranian missiles might strike Saudi cities. Yes, the kingdom would absorb some damage. Yes, the international community might express alarm about Saudi Arabia's alleged role in precipitating the conflict. But if the war achieved its strategic objectives, if Iran's capacity was genuinely and permanently degraded, if the Houthis lost their patron and Yemen could finally be stabilized, if Hezbollah was defunded and defanged, if the Iraqi proxy militias lost their direction and supply, then the temporary costs would be dwarfed by the permanent strategic gains. It was the same logic that animated the Yemen intervention in 2015, another MBS initiative that was supposed to be quick and decisive and turned into a decade-long catastrophe. The man has a consistent pattern of overestimating his ability to control the consequences of violent action and underestimating the resilience of his adversaries. The Iran war is following the same pattern at a dramatically larger scale. Iran was not supposed to hit every Gulf state. Iran was supposed to absorb the blows and then either collapse or negotiate from a position of extreme weakness. Instead, it chose the third option that Gulf strategists apparently failed to adequately model. It chose to make the war painful for everyone, to spread the costs of American and Israeli aggression across the entire region, to make clear to every Gulf monarchy that their soil was not a safe staging ground for attacks on Persian civilization. And in doing so, it placed MBS in a position where his double game became visible not as clever strategy, but as catastrophic miscalculation. The Vision 2030 project, which represents MBS's bid to transform Saudi Arabia from a petrostate into a diversified modern economy, was already facing headwinds before the war. NEOM, the flagship $500 billion futuristic city project in the northwest of the kingdom, had seen billions of dollars of contracts scaled back. The initial ambitions for a linear city stretching 170 kilometers through the desert had been dramatically reduced. Foreign investment, while significant, was not flowing at the pace required to fund the enormous transformation MBS had promised. Tourism targets were being revised downward. The entertainment and sports investments, the golf tournaments and boxing matches and Formula One races were generating attention, but not yet the economic returns that would justify the scale of spending. And now the war, which MBS had apparently calculated would enhance Saudi Arabia's strategic position and therefore its economic attractiveness, was instead driving insurance premiums higher, making the kingdom a target of Iranian missiles and generating the kind of regional instability that foreign investors spend their careers trying to avoid. The irony was almost too precise. The man who had spent a decade trying to attract the world's capital to Saudi Arabia had helped start a war that was now making Saudi Arabia less attractive to that same capital. Sovereign wealth funds were not increasing their Saudi exposure during a period when Iranian drones were intercepted over Riyadh. Technology companies were not expanding their Gulf headquarters when oil prices were at $100 per barrel, and regional supply chains were in disruption. The Vision 2030 logic assumed a stable regional environment that MBS's own private diplomacy had helped to destroy. And then there was the domestic dimension, arguably the most consequential for the long-term stability of the Saudi state. Saudi Arabia has one of the youngest populations in the world. A significant majority of Saudi citizens are under 30. These are people raised with the promise of Vision 2030, with the expectation of jobs and entertainment and a modernizing kingdom. They are also people who live in cities now receiving missile threat alerts, who watch the news and see Iranian drones intercepted over their country, who understand at some level that something has gone wrong with the grand strategy they were told would deliver prosperity and security simultaneously. MBS has managed domestic dissent through genuine popular reforms and severe repression. The reforms have bought him real support, particularly among young Saudis who wanted cinemas and concerts and the ability to drive and mix socially in ways the old religious establishment had forbidden. The repression has eliminated organized opposition. But neither can fully manage the anxiety of a population that discovers its cities are being attacked by a neighbor that its government had publicly claimed to have made peace with 3 years earlier. All of this is the context in which the Saudi denial of the New York Times report must be understood. It is not a minor diplomatic clarification. It is not a routine pushback against unflattering media coverage. It is the official statement of a government that is trying to manage the exposure of a strategy that has produced consequences far more complicated than its architect anticipated. It is the sound of a man backing away from the fire he started, hoping that the flames will not follow him, hoping that the world will accept the denial at face value and move on to the next news cycle. And it might work in the short term. The world has a very short attention span. The denial will be noted and then mostly forgotten as the next set of missile intercepts and diplomatic statements fills the information space. But the structural reality that the denial was designed to obscure will not disappear. Saudi Arabia privately lobbied for a war that is now costing the world $100 per barrel and costing the Gulf its security. A crown prince who presented himself as a modernizing peacemaker was, according to the evidence of multiple credible news organizations citing multiple officials with direct knowledge, privately urging escalation. The gap between the public performance and the private reality is not merely a matter of interesting journalism. It is the core strategic question that every Gulf state, every American ally, every global investor, and every regional government will now be weighing as they try to understand the true architecture of power in the post-war Middle East. Whatever happens next, whether Iran is eventually brought to the table, whether a ceasefire is negotiated, whether the Strait of Hormuz reopens and oil prices gradually decline, the record of how this war began will not be erased. The double game has been played. The evidence of it is accumulating in declassified cables and published reports and first-hand accounts that will eventually constitute the historical record. And that record will show that the man who denied making the calls was the same man who, according to every available indication, made them. That is the legacy that Saudi Arabia's categorical denial cannot erase. History is patient. It collects its evidence across years and decades, through the slow accumulation of documents and testimonies and declassified files that eventually reconstruct even the most carefully managed secrets. The men who privately engineered the conditions for the Iraq War of 2003 spent years watching their decisions be relitigated in inquiry commissions and journalistic investigations. The men who privately lobbied for this war will face the same reckoning, on a timetable they do not control. The missiles landing in Riyadh are the first installment of that reckoning. The official denial is the attempt to defer it. And the gap between the two, between the physical reality of Iranian ordnance striking Saudi cities and the official insistence that nothing was done to provoke it, is where the true history of this war is already being written by the journalists and officials and witnesses who understand what actually happened and who will not, despite every pressure, allow the world to forget it. The fire is burning. And the man who lit it is standing at the microphone, explaining very carefully and very officially that he was never near the matches. The world is watching. And the world is beginning, slowly but irreversibly, to understand that the war currently burning through the Middle East and reshaping global energy markets and killing civilians in cities from Manab to Manama was not simply a spontaneous American decision. It was the product of a strategy. It was the product of a relationship. It was the product of a double game played by a crown prince who understood that the greatest power in geopolitics is the power to make someone else pull the trigger for you, and who is now discovering, at enormous cost to his kingdom and to the world, that the person who pulls the trigger is never the only one responsible for where the bullet lands.